In the spring of 1917, a clerk in a building on the corner of Wall Street and Broad updated a single running figure on the firm's books. The number had been climbing for 2 years. By that spring, it had reached $398 million. It was the amount the British Empire owed to one private American partnership. And nothing stood behind it. No gold, no collateral, no pledged securities. The gold had stopped crossing the Atlantic months before, sunk or stranded by German submarines. The American railway shares Britain once owned had already been dumped into the New York market for cash. What remained was a promise. 2 governments, fighting for their lives, swearing that if they survived, they would pay. Nearly $400 million. Out to a single address in Lower Manhattan, backed by nothing but the hope that the right side won the war. If Britain and France lost, that paper turned to ash overnight, and with it the largest financial bet any American institution had ever placed. So ask the question the lenders were asking that spring. If the borrower cannot pay, who can? Who on earth is large enough to swallow a $400 million loss and leave the firm whole? In 1917, there was exactly one answer. The government of the United States. This is the documented story of how the private credit of one firm became, year by year and contract by contract, impossible to tell apart from the foreign policy of a neutral nation of 100 million people. How a war fought 3,000 miles across an ocean was financed quietly into America's own lap. Not by a conspiracy, not by a plot in a back room, but by something more ordinary and far more dangerous. A debt that grew too big to be allowed to fail. You were taught that America entered the First World War over a torpedo and a telegram. Both were real. Both mattered. But underneath the headlines sat a column of figures, and the figures had already decided most of the question long before the first American soldier ever boarded a ship. This is the war the textbooks never costed out. Before we open the ledger, this channel exists to trace the money the history books leave out, the loans, the commissions, and the quiet financial deals that decided wars and redrew nations. If that's the history you want, subscribe and stay with it. The numbers in this story only get bigger from here. When the war began in August 1914, the Allies did not have a fighting problem in America. They had a buying problem. Britain, France, and Russia all needed the same things from the same country at the same time. American steel for shells and rails. American copper for shell casings and wire. American wheat to feed armies. American explosives and the machine tools to manufacture more of all of it. The United States was the largest industrial economy on the planet, and it was officially neutral, which meant, in practice, that its factories would sell to anyone who arrived with money in hand. So the Allied governments sent their buyers. And the buyers made a costly discovery: they were competing against each other. Separate British, French, and Russian purchasing agents arrived in the same American markets, chasing the same limited supplies of copper, steel, and powder. They bid against one another. Every time a French agent outbid a British one for a shipment of brass, the price rose, and both governments paid more for less. The competition was inflating the cost of the war before a single American crate reached a European port. The Allies were, in effect, financing the American suppliers' profit margin out of their own disorganization. The solution arrived from inside the firm itself. In December 1914, a senior partner named Henry Davison crossed to London with a proposal that ended the bidding war by ending the competition. Root everything. Every Allied purchase made in the United States, through one house, one agent, one negotiator, one set of books. No more Allies bidding up the price against their own side. He presented it to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The British Army Council and the Admiralty accepted. In January 1915, they signed a commercial agency agreement, and the firm became the official purchasing agent for the British government in the United States. France soon entered a parallel arrangement of its own. The terms looked modest on paper. The firm would arrange the contracts, the credit, the insurance, and the shipping for everything Britain bought in America. And for this, it would take a commission of 1% on the value of every purchase. 1%. It sounds like a rounding error. It was not, because of the number it was multiplied against. Between January 1915 and April 1917, the firm bought more than $3 billion of war material for the Allies. That figure was measured in 1913 dollars, at a time when the entire annual budget of the United States federal government was a fraction of it. Around 60% of that $3 billion went directly into arms and munitions, shells, rifles, cartridges, explosives. The remaining 40% was the unglamorous bloodstream of a modern war: canned beef, locomotives, wheat, raw cotton, industrial chemicals, copper by the ton. To process a river of orders that size, the firm built a dedicated export department. At its peak, it ran on 175 hand-picked specialists managing 4,000 separate prime contracts at once, moving as much as $10 million of goods in a single day. It did not merely sign contracts. It organized the subcontractors, arranged the credit and the payment terms, coordinated American arms makers with Allied ordnance experts, and arranged the insurance and the shipping. Around it, Britain eventually deployed 10,000 of its own operatives across the United States, supervising the retooling of American factories and riding the freight trains down to the East Coast ports to guard the cargo onto the ships. That single British purchasing contract alone earned the firm roughly $30 million in commission, described at the time as one of the most lucrative single business arrangements in American history. But the commission, large as it was only the visible part of the story. The commission was the fee you could see. What grew quietly beneath it, invisible on any press report, was something with far more gravity: exposure. Hold on to that word, because in a moment it turns into a number. And the number is the largest foreign loan Wall Street had ever floated up to that day. Watch closely how a firm collecting a safe 1% fee quietly became a creditor with $500 million of its own survival riding on the outcome of the war. The instant that line is crossed, everything changes. A purchasing agent, at the start, spends the buyer's money. For the first months, that is exactly what happened, and it drained Britain dry with terrifying speed. Britain paid the way a rich man pays when the cash runs low. It sold the family silver. London ordered the liquidation of Britain's vast holdings of American railway and industrial stock. Shares its investors had accumulated over half a century and fed them into the New York market for dollars. When the shares ran thin, it shipped the gold itself, bullion crossing the Atlantic in the holds of warships to settle the bills. For a while, the invoices were covered by things Britain genuinely owned. The vault emptied far faster than London had ever imagined. By the autumn of 1915, the Allies needed something they had never before needed from the United States. Not goods, cash. A loan large enough to keep the purchasing machine running once the sellable securities and the shippable gold were gone. In September, an Anglo-French financial commission, led by Lord Reading, sailed into New York Harbor. Over the following weeks, they sat down with roughly 100 of the most powerful financiers and bankers in the country, a delegation that, in passing, included a Chicago banker named Charles Dawes, who would resurface in the same story a decade later. The deal they assembled was, at that moment, the largest foreign loan in the entire history of Wall Street, $500 million, raised through a 5-year bond, paying 5% interest, marketed directly to the American investing public. To distribute paper on that scale, the firm assembled a syndicate of roughly 2,200 banks, reaching into nearly every state in the Union. The hope was openly stated within the commission that if enough ordinary Americans put their own savings into Allied bonds, public sympathy and the government's posture would tilt away from neutrality. The money was meant to buy more than munitions. It was meant to buy alignment. And then the sale stumbled. The bond was hard to place, and the reasons reached straight into the divided soul of the country. Across the American interior, large populations wanted no part of financing Britain's war. The German-American communities of the Midwest had no desire to fund the enemies of Germany. The Irish-American populations had no love for the British crown. The German ambassador in Washington had already made it known that Berlin regarded the flotation of such loans as an unfriendly act, and there were open rumors that a victorious Germany might refuse to honor the paper at all. Investors hesitated. The full $500 million was not cleanly absorbed by the public, and the underwriting houses were left holding bonds they had expected to sell on. This is the precise moment the relationship changed in kind, and not merely in size. When a bank underwrites a loan and cannot sell all of it, it stops being an agent collecting a fee on someone else's deal. It becomes a creditor with its own capital at risk in the outcome. From the autumn of 1915 forward, the solvency of the British and French governments and the solvency of the firm were no longer two separate questions. They were one balance sheet, read from opposite shores of the Atlantic. The fee earner had become the stakeholder, and the borrowing did not slow. It accelerated. By the spring of 1917, Britain had drawn something on the order of $2.5 to $2.7 billion through American channels. Direct credits to France climbed from £20 million in 1915 to 1916 to a staggering £243 million the following year. Early advances had already gone out the door. A first loan of $12 million to Russia, $50 million in one-year notes arranged for France in 1915 simply to cover the cost of moving its money across a collapsing exchange rate. Then the gold stopped moving. German submarines made steady bullion runs across the Atlantic too dangerous to sustain. Britain's stock of sellable American shares was nearly exhausted. The Allies had run out of things they actually owned to hand over. So the firm did the one thing that kept the machine turning. It advanced its own credit against nothing but a signature and a hope. No security, no asset pledged, backed only by the survival of two governments at war. By the early months of 1907, that running balance had reached the figure the firm's own later accounting fixed at $398 million. That number was the trap. And the trap had not been laid for Britain. Without a single person designing it that way, it had closed around the United States. Now keep your eye on one man who saw the trap forming and tried to shut it down before it sprang, the President of the United States himself. What he did in November 1916 to choke off the lending was the right financial instinct at exactly the wrong moment. And it backfired in a way that exposed just how little time the whole arrangement had left. One man in Washington understood exactly what was being built, and he moved to stop it. Woodrow Wilson did not want America bankrolling this war, and his reasoning ran on financial logic, not sentiment. He understood that the loans were the war's fuel line. As long as Wall Street kept refilling Allied credit, the Allies could keep buying shells and keep fighting, choke the credit off, and the purchasing machine would stall, and a stalled war is a war that has to negotiate. Money, in Wilson's analysis, was the most dangerous contraband of all, more decisive than any cargo of rifles, because the nation that controlled the lending controlled who could afford to keep fighting and for how long. He wanted that leverage in Washington's hands, not in a private syndicate's, and he wanted the United States to enter the peace as the world's creditor rather than its supplier. In late November 1916, he acted on that conviction. Wilson had the Federal Reserve Board issue a formal warning, instructing American banks and private investors to stop making foreign currency loans and to stop buying foreign securities. It was aimed without disguise at London and Paris, and the timing cut to the bone. Whether Wilson knew the exact figures or not, the firm was at that very moment only days away from floating a fresh Anglo-French bond reported to be as large as $1.5 billion, intended to fund the great Allied military offensives planned for 1917. The warning detonated under that plan. The bond was abandoned. The market price of existing Allied paper sagged. The whole delicate transatlantic structure of private war finance lurched to the brink, and the firm's enormous unbacked loan sat at the heart of it, dragged suddenly into full daylight. Look at the position Wilson's own warning had revealed. The Allies could no longer raise meaningful new private money in America. France had reached the absolute end of its rope. Britain could perhaps carry itself a while longer on its own account, but it could not keep funding the purchases of the entire alliance on credit, not for long. And the moment Allied buying stopped, the loans already outstanding could no longer be serviced. The bonds in the hands of American banks and ordinary American investors would begin to fail. Wilson's gambit did not produce peace. It produced something else. It exposed, with brutal clarity, how little time the existing arrangement had left to run. And then the financial ground gave way. In the early weeks of 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, and the immediate casualty, before any soldier, was the payment system itself. The submarines made it impossible to ship gold across the Atlantic at all, severing the last channel by which Britain could settle its bills with anything it actually owned. From that point, every further purchase had to ride on pure credit. The diplomatic provocations piled up alongside it. Neutral and American ships sunk without warning. The Zimmermann telegram in which Berlin dangled American territory before Mexico. But the financial fact underneath was starker than any of them. The Allies were now buying entirely on an American IOU that only an American victory could ever redeem. On the 6th of April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, and in that instant, the entire financial problem changed hands. 18 days after the declaration of war, on the 24th of April 1917, Wilson signed the first Liberty Loan Act. Read the mechanism slowly, because the mechanism is the entire story compressed into a single piece of legislation. The act authorized the United States Treasury to borrow up to $5 billion from the American public. And it authorized the Treasury to use up to $3 billion of that borrowed money to purchase the war debts of the Allied governments. Translated out of legal language, and it reads like this. The American government would now borrow from American citizens, lend the proceeds to Britain and France, and in doing so, absorb the loans that private institutions had been carrying. The debt did not disappear. It was lifted off the books of one Wall Street firm and set down on the shoulders of the American taxpayer, repackaged as a patriotic government bond. The Allies did not wait. On the 25th of April, a single day after the act became law, Great Britain drew down $200 million from the new American credit. Hold the two pictures side by side. Before April 1917, the creditors of the Allied war effort were private American bondholders and a syndicate of banks led by one firm, all of them carrying real risk of real loss. After April 1917, the creditor was the government of the United States, and the risk had been quietly transferred to the citizenry. Across 4 successive Liberty Loan campaigns and a final Victory Loan, ordinary Americans were sold the patriotic duty of buying the very bonds that financed the debts their country's entry into the war had just nationalized. Roughly $20 billion was raised from the public during American belligerency. The schoolteacher in Ohio and the shopkeeper in Pennsylvania now held, through their government, the paper that had begun life as an overdraft on Wall Street. This is the quiet hinge that the standard classroom history skips entirely. The popular account of 1917 runs on the submarine and the telegram, and those things were true and they mattered. But beneath them lay a financial reality that had made genuine neutrality close to impossible long before the Declaration was signed. A neutral nation's most important bank had become so deeply committed to one side of a world war that the defeat of that side would have detonated a financial catastrophe at home. 2 decades later, the United States Senate tried to put a number on it. From 1934 to 1936, a committee chaired by Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota pulled the wartime books into the open, the contracts, the commissions, the loan ledgers, the profit margins, across 93 hearings and 39 volumes of testimony, with the firm's partners on the stand under oath. The figures that surfaced were staggering. The DuPont powder makers were shown to have earned wartime profit margins running into the hundreds of percent, by some accounts as high as 400%. On the explosives, the Allies bought through that same purchasing pipeline. The investigation laid out how completely the profits of the banking and munitions houses had been wired to the survival of Allied credit. Every dollar of Allied borrowing that kept the war going was a dollar of commission, interest, and margin flowing back across Wall Street. The committee concluded that the sheer scale of private profit in the war, and in the lending that financed it, had made keeping the United States neutral materially harder than it would otherwise have been. But it found no evidence of a conspiracy to start the war. And it found no evidence that President Wilson had ever been personally influenced in his dealings with Germany by any financial stake. That distinction is the honest spine of this entire story, so let it stand plainly. There was no secret plot. No banker pushed a button that sent America to war. What the record establishes is narrower than a conspiracy, and in some ways heavier than one, that by the time the United States had to choose, the financial cost of staying out had been stacked higher and higher. One contract, one bond, one unsecured advance at a time, until the cost of neutrality had quietly grown larger than the cost of joining the war. Nobody had to conspire. The arithmetic conspired on its own. So who actually paid, and who walked away richer? In a moment we settled the books on all 3 sides. What the firm pocketed and what it offloaded onto the Treasury. What Britain owed for the next 2 decades. And the single figure that explains why the financial capital of the planet crossed the Atlantic and never came back. The final accounting is where the real price shows up. Tally what the arrangement actually produced on every side of the books. For the firm, the gains were vast and, crucially, collected. A 1% commission on more than $3 billion of purchasing. Roughly $30 million from the British contract alone. The underwriting position on the largest foreign loan Wall Street had ever floated. And, for 2.5 years, a seat at the dead center of the most lucrative trade flow on the planet. Then, when Washington stepped in, the single most dangerous line on the books, that $400 million exposure with nothing behind it, was quietly assumed by the Treasury. The firm had carried the risk through the most perilous stretch, and then watched the worst of it slide onto the public's shoulders the moment the public's government went to war. For Britain and France, the arrangement bought survival on a generational installment plan. The debt did not die when the guns did. All through the 1920s and into the 1930s, the United States chased repayment without mercy. One debtor nation at a time, each summoned separately to Washington, no cancellations, no political bargains, no forgiveness. And the reason America could not simply wave the debt away led straight back to those Liberty bonds. Millions of American citizens were holding them and expected to be paid. Forgive Europe's loans, and Washington would have to tax its own voters to fill the hole. War debt had been wired directly into the American kitchen table, and it stayed live for a decade. Britain had marched into the war as the foremost creditor on earth. It lent out a debtor to New York. The financial capital of the world had finished its crossing of the Atlantic, and it never made the return trip. And for the United States, the price was paid in the currency no ledger records. Entry into a war that cost more than 116,000 American lives. But there was also a transformation that outlasted the war by a century. The vast machinery built to sell Liberty bonds, the idea of the ordinary citizen as a holder of government securities, the creation of a mass public market in federal debt where almost none had existed before, became one of the foundation stones of modern American public finance. The very mechanism that nationalized a Wall Street overdraft in 1917 is, in updated and expanded form, the mechanism that funds the United States government to this day. And the deepest lesson belongs to the men in the building at Wall Street and Broad. They never needed to want the war. They needed only to be owed by the winning side. By making itself the indispensable creditor of one camp in World War, a single private firm had quietly bent the geometry of an entire nation, so that its own survival and the foreign policy of a neutral republic of 100 million people came to point in precisely the same direction, as if, by accident, lay the three facts down in a row and the conclusion writes itself. The Allies needed America to win the war. The firm needed the Allies to survive and repay. And by the spring of 1917, the only borrower on earth large enough to cover that debt was the one great power still standing on the sidelines. It did not stay on the sidelines. The story you were handed in school explains the spring of 1917 with a torpedo and a telegram. The numbers explain it with a single figure. $398 million, owed to one address in Lower Manhattan, with nothing behind it but hope, and with the plain documented fact that by then the cheapest way left to protect that figure was to stop being neutral. That is not the war they teach in the classroom. It is the war that was decided years in advance, in a quiet column of figures that almost no one was ever meant to read. If this is the kind of history you were never taught, the version written in loans and ledgers instead of dates and battles, then subscribe, because every video on this channel follows the money the same way. There's a financial story behind almost every war you think you understand. We'll trace the next one together.